Well, General Casey, it's so great to connect today. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, somebody who's had so much leadership experience throughout their life. So thanks for coming on today.
No, great. Nice to be with you. And I'm looking forward to hearing all about Lawrence, Kansas.
It is beautiful. Uh, we have some friends when we were in Utah, they moved out to Utah from Lawrence, Kansas, and they said, "Oh, Lawrence, Kansas is just beautiful." And we're like, "Really? What's in Kansas?" But now that we're here, we absolutely do love it. So you've had an incredible career and you've done things that maybe you couldn't have ever even imagined. Maybe you had expectations, but for many of us to be in the rooms you were in, the places you were at is almost just unbelievable. And so as you think back on your experiences you've had, the lessons you've learned, what experiences, lessons would you most want to pass on to others?
Sure. And as you know, I have actually been teaching leadership in the business school at Cornell for it'll be 10 years this November. And when I'm talking to the MBA students, I'm giving them the opportunity to form and evaluate their leadership style at this point in their careers. And what I tell them is, it was a lesson I learned in the Army that before I even came in the Army, a lot of my personality and leadership style had already been shaped. And then three people really influenced me and influenced the way that I led over the course of my life. The first is my grandfather. And when I was about 15, put his arm around my shoulder, took me off to the side of the porch, and said, George, I want to tell you something. You're no better than anyone, and no one's better than you. So treat everyone with respect, but don't take any guff from anybody. And more than anything else, as I've reflected back, that formed the core of who I was as a person and how I led. I treated everybody with respect, from the lowest private to the prime minister of Iraq. And that more than any other thing really shaped how I dealt with people and so how I led. The second was my dad. My dad was a great high school and college athlete. He was actually the captain of the West Point hockey team. And he took me off to the side as I was going off to college, and he said, never be afraid to try to be the very best. And, kind of the emphasis on try kind of went right over my head at the time. But as I reflected back on that's how I tried to lead. I tried to make every organization I was part of the best that it could be. It wasn't about me. It was about the organization. Now, did we make it every time? No, but we never stopped reaching and trying to be the very best. Then the third person was a guy named Vince Lombardi. You might have heard of him.
I've heard of Vince.
Yeah. I had the opportunity to work for him for one season when I was in college,
Wow.
and he was the coach of the Washington Redskins. And my position was not very exalted. I was an assistant equipment manager. So socks, jocks, and t-shirts were my specialty. But I got to watch the man work. And I watched how he focused the efforts of the team on what he thought were the most important elements of success. And then he insisted on disciplined execution to standards, to high standards, to achieve those goals. And again, I took that and I applied it to every organization I was a part of. I sat down and I said, what's it going to take to make this organization the best that it can be? And then I focused the efforts and define the standards that I wanted people to meet to achieve that goal. And so really those things more than anything else shaped how I led, from my first platoon as a second lieutenant to four-star general when I led the Army.
Wow, really cool lessons. I love those quotes and ideas. You're no better than anyone and no one's better than you. Quite profound. You could spend a lot of time thinking about that. And it sounds like, yeah, it really impacted you throughout your life. So as you're going through the military and you've got these kind of your leadership style, as you say, already kind of shaped, how are you thinking about growing on this, evolving, or even maybe when you teach your students, what's the balance between learning new things and like embracing kind of who you already are as a leader.
Yeah, that's great. And what I tell the students is that becoming an effective leader is a journey. And you can become an effective leader if you commit to the journey, if you commit to learning and growing at every level of leadership. You know, in the Army, every non-commissioned officer and every officer goes to 4 levels of leadership training. And these aren't weekend classes. I mean, these are 6 to 9 months programs to make them better leaders. Yeah, and so that's what I came up in, and I learned that every time I stepped up to a new position, I had to sit down with myself and say, are the skills that got you here the same skills that are going to take you there? And the answer was usually no.
Hmm.
And when I found I was having difficulty being ruthlessly candid with myself, I could always ask my wife, and she was very happy to point out the things that I needed to work on. But I did that at every level of leadership, and you know the answer was what had to be no, they aren't. You need different skills, and probably the most significant uh, change I had to make in the way I led was in the army I came up in. Everyone told me, look down into your organization, make your organization as good as it can be, and everything else will take care of itself. Well, I found that got me till I was about lieutenant colonel. And as I moved up to the rank of colonel, I started to realize more and more that the keys to my success lay outside of my own organization rather than inside. So I had to spend progressively more and more of my time influencing people outside my organization rather than inside. And that took a whole new set of skills because trying influencing people outside of your direct control requires a lot more intellectual and emotional energy than it does directing people below you.
What a great example of that illustrates this point. I remember as a young kind of business student learning about how founders so often would eventually get replaced. And it always bugged me. It's like, how, this founder that started the company, of course they're capable of leading a large organization. They're the founder. But over time you realize, well, it just depends. It depends on whether that founder learns the new skills that are required because managing a company of 5 people is completely different than managing a company of 5,000. And what an interesting shift for you to make that transition from looking down to now I've got to influence people outside.
Yeah, and like I said, it takes a lot more thought, but the payoff is significant. I'll just give you a quick example from my time in Iraq. You know, when you go off to those assignments, you go around Washington and you meet the people that are going to support you. And so I did. And everybody said, hey, when you need anything, just ask and we'll get it right over to you. Great. So I get over to Iraq and I decide that I need to change what we were doing to put coalition trainers in with Iraqi military and police units. To do that, I needed about 3,000 more troops of significant rank, and it was going to cost about $1 billion.
Wow.
So I went back to Washington and I said, okay, here's what I need. They said, why do you need that? So it took me 3 or 4 months of video teleconferences, of in-person meetings to influence the people outside of my direct control to say yes to what I felt I needed,
Yeah.
make that operation in Iraq successful. And I mean, that was just an example, but it doesn't happen overnight. You know, it's sometimes it's as mundane as getting people's schedules to match up.
So this is maybe an impossibly large question, but as you think back on your experience leading, what was the hardest thing you did? What was the most challenging hurdle you overcame?
Well, but the hardest job I had was Iraq, and I can't say that I necessarily overcame the challenge, but we certainly advanced the ball and left Iraq in a much better position to deal with the challenges it was facing than when we got there. But that was, I mean, I think the thing about Iraq that made it so well, it was never, there was not one thing that made it so complex. Uh, but start from the fact that on September 11th, 2001, the American military got thrust into a fundamentally new environment. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, we found ourselves not fighting enemy armies, which is what I spent 30 years of a 40-year career training to do,
Mhm.
but we were fighting insurgencies. And nobody it left in the army had done that because we hadn't done that since Vietnam. So much like happened with COVID, we were thrust into a fundamentally new situation where the leaders and the led were learning together. And I had come up in an army where we thought our leaders knew everything. In fact, they sometimes tried to make us think that they knew everything.
Yeah.
Uh, but we had to have the humility to say, look, I don't know this if this is exactly right, but here's what I think. So this is what we're going to do. And framing that way ahead. The ambassador and I, we were told to have a presentation for the president in 30 days after we got there about how we were going to move Iraq forward. And we did it in a little over 30 days. But as you can imagine, that was a pretty intense period because I only had about 80 days from the time that I was told I was going to Iraq to the time we had to brief the president.
Wow.
And so we had to come up to speed pretty quickly. But when we did it, we knew at the best we were going to do was an 80% solution, maybe.
Yeah.
In the Army, we used to say there's only two kinds of plans, those that might work and those that won't work. And because we're human, the best we're going to do is a plan that might work. And we knew that. But we had to get some preliminary instructions out rapidly to the men and women that were working for us.
Yeah, really interesting example that demonstrates the importance of continual learning. And it sounds like the higher you rise up in leadership, it's almost like the the skill that you really need. Of course, you're laying a foundation of all the skills that have helped you get to where you're at. But at some point, the skill that becomes most valuable is the skill of learning and adapting to new situations.
Yeah, and humility. I was as I was climbing the ladder, I probably wasn't comfortable sitting in a meeting saying, I don't know the answer to that. But the higher I got, the more I realized that I didn't know, and in fact that I could never know. And so I had to be comfortable saying that, and I had to be careful because sometimes it made people nervous. In Iraq,
Yeah.
people would say, "What do you think, General?" I say, "I don't know." They say, "Holy crap, we're screwed. The general doesn't know." But the Army added humility to the characteristics it's wanted all its leaders to have in 2019 when they published the second leadership
Interesting.
manual since September 11th. And they added humility to that. And I think that speaks volumes of how important being able to accept the fact that we're human.
Yeah, that's such an interesting tension as a leader because as the leader, often you're expected to have all the answers. But if you pretend like you have all the answers and you're wrong, that's not helpful. If you have no answers as a leader, that's not helpful. So you're constantly walking this fine line between having a plan, inspiring confidence, but not being overconfident.
No, exactly. And candor and transparency, I find, are critical for a leader in that position. And what I found I had to do is to say, okay, uh, I have to make a decision here. So here's how I see the situation. And because I see the situation this way, this is what I'm doing. If that situation changes, we're going to do something else. But this is my frame of mind right now. This is
Mhm.
why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I found that when I empowered people that disagreed with me, because no matter what the issue is, you'll always have people that are on the other side.
Yeah.
If you think you're going to go this way, there's always a group over here that says, no, we should go that way. Well, what I found I was doing was I was empowering those people to come back to me and say, hey, General, guess what? I was right and you were wrong. And believe me, the colonels love to tell the general that they were right and the general was wrong.
Well, maybe the last question as we wrap up here. I could talk to you for days about this. Before we got started, you'd mentioned that you'd written some letters to grandchildren. And If you just had to summarize, what's kind of like the main idea that you're sharing when you're trying to pass on kind of your life's wisdom to future generations, what sort of things are you sharing with your grandchildren?
Well, I mean, it won't surprise you that the first two things I share with them are the first two things I shared with you.
Right.
You know better than anyone, no one's better than you. And then never be afraid to try to be the very best. But then the last three things I tell them is be a man or woman of your word. If you tell someone you're going to do something, you either do it or you tell them why you're not going to do it. But being a man or woman of character is what gives leaders the moral authority that it takes to lead successfully today. And the next thing I tell them is never stop learning. That you keep building on that, and you know better than I do that if you stop learning today, you're going to get blown right past.
Hmm.
And so there's a big world out there, and you got to keep going after it. And then the last thing I tell them, family is everything, and that's the way I was brought up, and we work very hard to keep the family together.
Well, really cool to hear these lessons from you and also hear stories and examples from your life of how you have been applying these lessons. I just want to thank you so much. This was such a treat for me. I can't wait to listen to this episode again, share it with my family, share it with my students. So just want to tell you with all the gratitude I possibly can. Thanks so much for sharing these lessons, for your service, and for coming on today.
Okay, Nate, fine. Thank you very much. Just shoot me a copy when it's done.
Absolutely. Okay, yeah, I'll hit.